At the beginning of the film, a father named Brian is seen playing with his son in his front yard. But the calm atmosphere turned into chaos when two cars containing a group of gangs were involved in a shootout. Brian was quick to protect his son, but unfortunately his son was shot by a stray bullet and eventually died. Brian, who did not accept it, tried to pursue the gangsters to be responsible. After one of the gang's cars rolled over, only one group was left standing. Brian then took an iron bar from the rubbish bin. However, he came face to face with the gang leader Gonzalez, who got out of his car with a gun. Instead of getting justice for his son's death, Brian felt pain when Gonzalez fired a shot right into his throat. In short order, the incident made it to the local media and was investigated by the police. Meanwhile, Brian survived after undergoing surgery and treatment for approximately 4 months in hospital. Brian finally woke up with his wife, who always faithfully accompanied him. However, Brian wanted to wake up immediately and take revenge for the death of his favorite son, even though at that time, Brian was still limping. In fact, he couldn't even speak anymore, as he was permanently mute due to the gunshot wound he received. A few days later, Brian was allowed to go home. On his way home, Brian saw everyone on the road as enemies who had to be killed and eliminated, as if they were all responsible for his son's death. Arriving home, a father's heart broke when he had to accept the fact that his little son was no more. The days that were usually filled with play are now gone. Brian was furious and still could not accept the death of his beloved son. Days passed, and Brian only spent his time in the garage drinking. His communication with his wife worsened, and even face-to-face meetings were rare. This had a significant impact on his household and Brian's life as a whole. As he sat in the courtyard, Brian thought back to the day his son was killed by a stray bullet. The pain never seems to go away, so rather than just sitting around doing nothing, Brian, who no longer cares about his own life, is desperate for revenge. He started his plan by going to the police station to find out the faces of the perpetrators. After getting information about Gonzalez and his men, Brian posted their pictures on a board in his garage. He began a series of physical exercises and learned to attack with weapons. Brian's ambition was to kill everyone on the board on the 24th, the day before Christmas.
His defense and limit his blocking the ground. Striking the blade, torquing your blade, make sure that you twist.
He trained his physique and skills and bought a used car for revenge. As a mechanic, it wasn't difficult for Brian to modify the car to make it better, complete with various interesting features ready to face unexpected situations. It wasn't enough to train physically and modify vehicles. Brian also attended shooting classes to improve his skills and confidence. Three months later, his wife finally gave up and decided to go home to her parents after Brian no longer wanted to improve his relationship. Brian was only focused on his revenge plan. Brian's life was completely ruined, with no chance of turning back. Not wanting to waste time with sadness, Brian immediately took to the field to test his car. Brian observed Gonzalez from a distance to confirm his target and found some of Gonzalez's confidence. This made it easier for Brian to determine his first target. As the execution day approached, Brian did his final training. After almost 7 months of focused training, Brian finally showed tremendous progress as all the aspects needed for revenge were perfectly achieved. One day, Brian decided to shop in the neighborhood where Gonzalez and his gangsters lived. As he was about to leave the door, a little boy reminded him of his son. Unconsciously, Brian hugged the child tightly, feeling a deep sense of longing because he could not accept the loss of his beloved son. As he was putting in the groceries, Gonzalez suddenly appeared and turned out to be a well-liked and idolized figure in the neighborhood. Brian's eyes were filled with vengeance. He wanted to stab Gonzalez right then and there. However, Brian accidentally bumped into Gonzalez's girlfriend when he was about to do so. The person was equally lacking in ethics and manners, as she deliberately spilled ice cream into Brian's face. This made Brian even more furious and eager for revenge. One day before the execution day, Brian began to launch his action. He went to the home of one of Gonzalez's confidants, Carlos. Although Brian had no experience in the criminal world, he was desperate to break into Carlos' house. No matter what a person's background is, no matter how much experience he has, when his loved ones are hurt or his life is taken away, an ordinary person like Brian, who has never committed violence, can be this determined to get justice. Brian forced Carlos to fill out a form with questions such as the name of his gang, who his associates were, where they were located, and the businesses they ran. When Carlos finished writing everything down, there was a fierce fight. However, Brian's much stronger determination allowed him to win the fight. He dragged Carlos' body and left him in front of a police detective's house, complete with a letter containing all of Carlos' confessions. That day, the day before Christmas, Brian was seen preparing himself. He brought various equipment, such as bulletproof vests, handmade explosives, and firearms. Then, he made a pilgrimage to his son's grave for the last time. In short, Brian arrived in the neighborhood where Gonzalez and his gang lived. By chance, he saw 2 gangsters pickpocketing and hurting a pedestrian couple. Right after the 2 gangsters finished their act, Brian immediately turned around. He pinched them both against the wall of the house. After successfully killing the 2, Brian cut off their fingers and sent them to Gonzalez. The aim was to make Gonzalez think the action was carried out by a rival gangster group. Brian had planned all this to pit the 2 gangster groups against each other. That night, Gonzalez sent most of his men to attack the rival gangsters. Amid the commotion, a policewoman was seen intervening, putting her own life in danger. Seeing this situation, Brian needed to assist her by breaking the gangster's concentration using his driving skills. Unfortunately, the The policewoman died before being taken to hospital. Brian also realized that he had been filmed by one of Gonzalez's men. He quickly grabbed the mobile phone, but the video had already been sent to Gonzalez. Because it had already been sent, Brian filmed himself shooting the subordinate to make Gonzalez even more angry. Gonzalez also remembered Brian's face, which he thought had died 7 months ago. Unhappy with the situation, Gonzalez called his right-hand man, Ruiz, to bring Brian's head. However, Brian came alone to lure them out. He led the chase to the flyover. There, Brian cried again, remembering his son. However, time didn't allow him to dwell on his grief, so Brian hit the gas again. As Ruiz and his men chased, Brian came to a dead end. 3 gangsters were making a transaction in that place. Instead of being afraid or retreating, Brian, who did not care about his own life, was desperate to break through without caring about the 3 gangsters. Also, Brian even managed to get Ruiz into an accident, including knocking out one of the gangsters chasing him. At the same time, a detective who got a clue about the gangster's address decided to act alone without the help of his team. Meanwhile, Brian is seen resting just as Gonzalez sends a group message on one of his men's mobile phones. The message asks the remaining troops to assemble at headquarters. Brian sees the opportunity to finish them all off. In short, Brian managed to get into the building pretty brutally. He quickly grabbed his shotgun and took advantage of his motorbike's leaking tank. Just as Gonzalez and his girlfriend were dancing while enjoying the effects of drugs, Brian managed to finish off all the troops below. Now, he had to climb the stairs to the floor where Gonzalez was, but it was no easy task, as he would probably die on the way when he faced a dozen of Gonzalez's men. However, Brian did not care about his own life. Whether he lived or died, at least he could eliminate more gangsters who had disturbed many people. People not afraid of death will more easily carry out actions without much thought. Brian immediately set a trap in the form of explosive wire to prevent anyone from entering the room where Gonzalez was. Ruiz was still alive and managed to survive the accident. Just as the 2 of them were fighting, 3 of Gonzalez's men appeared. However, Ruiz seemed to be a strong man who could not die even after being shot twice. Therefore, Brian decided to use another method, which was to take a large caliber machine gun. It wasn't long before the detective arrived, just in time to take down all the gangsters. Just as he was about to arrest Brian, Gonzalez's girlfriend appeared with her submachine gun, forcing both of them to take cover. Brian finally managed to emerge from the girl's left side. Although he wanted to shoot her in retaliation for the ice cream she had spilled, Brian still had a conscience and let her go. However, because the girl was acting out, Brian was forced to kill her. Now it's Gonzalez's turn, the last and only target he has to kill. As the leader of the gangsters, Gonzalez is too afraid to come out in the open, so Brian must follow him into his personal room. Unfortunately for Brian, he found himself in a tight spot when Gonzalez put a gun to his head. However, the detective managed to shoot Gonzalez in the shoulder from behind. This allowed Brian to take his revenge slowly by strangling him until he was out of breath.